The wind howled as if it were calling her name, but Rosa knew better. She stood on the snow-covered porch of her family's old house, her frail body shivering uncontrollably. Her breath came out in desperate clouds of white mist as she watched the taillights of the car slowly disappearing into the distance. Her grandchildren, the ones she had raised after their parents died, had left her here, alone, in the biting cold of a winter's night. For the first time in her life, she felt truly abandoned. Her legs buckled as she clung to the wooden railing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The icy wind sliced through her old threadbare coat, and she realized she had no keys, no phone, and no way back inside. The warmth and light of her home were just beyond that locked door, but it might as well have been a world away. The day had started out like any other, though Rosa had noticed the growing distance between herself and her grandchildren, Ethan and Sarah, over the past year. Ethan was in his early 20s, a young man who had once been full of dreams, now soured by bitterness over his financial struggles. Sarah, only a year younger, had always been the quiet one. But lately, she had become withdrawn, spending most of her time on her phone, barely acknowledging Rosa's presence. It had been Rosa's idea to host a family dinner, an old tradition she held on to dearly, hoping it would bring them closer. She spent the morning baking her famous apple pie, something their mother had loved, and slow-cooking the stew she had taught Ethan to make when he was just a boy. Rosa had hoped the familiar smells of home-cooked food would stir something in them, reminding them of better times when they were a family, despite the hardships they'd endured. But the atmosphere during dinner was cold, almost as cold as the night that was fast approaching. Ethan had been irritable from the moment he sat down, complaining about the high cost of living, the lack of job opportunities, and the student loans that seemed to hang over him like a storm cloud. Sarah, barely looking up from her phone, muttered a few words of agreement, her tone indifferent. Rosa, trying to keep the peace, suggested that they all spend more time together as a family. But that's when things took a turn. It was a casual comment, a suggestion really, but Ethan took it as an attack. He slammed his fist on the table, accusing Rosa of being out of touch, of not understanding how hard things were for them. The argument escalated quickly. Rosa, still reeling from Ethan's outburst, tried to explain that she only wanted to help, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. That's when Ethan made his cruel suggestion. "Maybe you should sell the house, Grandma. It's too big for you anyway. You could help us out with some of that money." Rosa's heart sank. This house wasn't just a building. It was her home, the place where she had raised her children, and later her grandchildren. It was filled with memories, and to her, it was the last piece of herself she had to offer. She couldn't believe Ethan would even suggest it. "No," she said firmly. "This house is not for sale. It's our home, and I'm not leaving." But Ethan wasn't done. "You're selfish," he spat. "You're sitting on all this, and you don't care that we're struggling. You don't care about us." Sarah, usually silent, joined in. "He's right, Grandma. You don't understand how hard it is for us. You don't get it." The words cut deeper than any knife. The grandchildren she had cared for, loved, and protected were now turning on her, not because they hated her, but because they had become lost in their own struggles. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what they would do next. The argument ended abruptly when Ethan stood up, his face a mix of anger and frustration. Without another word, he grabbed his coat, motioning for Sarah to follow. Rosa stood up too, her voice trembling as she asked, "Where are you going? Don't leave like this." Ethan's response was cold. "You've made it clear, Grandma. You don't care about us, and we don't need you." Before she could stop them, Ethan and Sarah walked out the door, slamming it shut behind them. Rosa was left standing there in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the car engine starting up outside jolted her into action, and she rushed to the front door, throwing it open just in time to see them backing out of the driveway. Panic surged through her. She stepped out onto the porch, her voice hoarse as she called after them, "Ethan, "Sarah, please, don't do this." But they didn't stop. The car pulled out onto the snow-covered road, and within moments, it was gone, leaving Rosa standing in the cold, staring into the empty darkness. She turned to go back inside, only to realize that she had left her keys and phone on the kitchen table. The door had locked behind her. She was trapped outside, with no way back in, and the temperature was dropping fast. Her first thought was to walk to a neighbor's house for help, but the nearest house was a mile away, and with the snow starting to fall, it was a dangerous journey for someone her age. For a moment, Rosa stood there, frozen not by the cold, but by the disbelief of what had just happened. Her grandchildren had left her, abandoned her in the middle of a bitter winter night, with no way to reach safety. The wind picked up, biting at her face and hands. Her breath quickened, and she knew she had to act. With shaking hands, she tightened the scarf around her neck and pulled her coat closer, though it did little to stop the chill. She glanced around, looking for any sign of help, but the road was empty, and the snow was beginning to fall harder. She had no choice. She had to start walking. Each step was a struggle. The snow crunched under her boots, and the icy wind tore at her clothes, making her feel as if the cold were seeping into her very bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she could feel her strength waning. She tried to focus on her surroundings, but everything was becoming a blur of white. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could happen. Frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. Her legs began to feel heavy, and every step was harder than the last. She thought about stopping, just for a moment, to rest, but she knew that if she sat down, she might not get back up. She had to keep going. She had to survive. As the minutes dragged on, Rosa's vision started to blur. She could feel the cold tightening its grip on her, pulling her down into the snow. She wasn't sure how much longer she could last. She whispered a prayer, asking for strength, for warmth, for anything that would keep her going. Just as she was about to give in to the cold, she saw a faint light flickering in the distance, a cabin, a glimmer of hope. Rosa's steps quickened, her heart pounding in her chest as she focused on that small, distant light. She didn't know who lived there or if they would help, but it was her only chance. She pushed forward, her body trembling with exhaustion and cold, determined not to let this be the end. Rosa's breath fogged the air in short, desperate puffs as she trudged through the deepening snow. The light ahead was flickering like a fragile candle, barely visible through the swirls of wind and snow. Every step was heavier than the last, as though the cold had taken hold of her limbs, slowing her down with each passing second. Her coat, thin and worn from years of use, was no match for the biting winter night. The icy wind cut through it as if it weren't even there. She could feel her body growing weaker, the chill sinking deeper into her bones. Her toes had gone numb long ago, and her fingers felt like they were encased in blocks of ice. She'd heard stories about people lost in the snow, how the cold could lull you into a deadly sleep, a sleep from which you'd never wake. But she wouldn't let that happen, not tonight, not like this. She had to reach that light, no matter what. The ground became uneven beneath her feet, the snow hiding patches of ice and jagged rocks that threatened to trip her with every step. She stumbled once, catching herself before she fell, but the shock sent a painful jolt through her tired muscles. For a moment, she paused, clutching her side, panting heavily. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning her lungs. It would be so easy to sit down, just for a minute, just to rest. But she knew better. Sitting down would be the end. If she stopped moving, she'd never get up again. Gritting her teeth, Rosa pushed forward, forcing her legs to keep moving despite the pain, despite the cold that gnawed at her body. The light grew closer, but slowly, agonizingly slowly. She wasn't even sure if it was real anymore, or just a cruel trick of her imagination, a false hope conjured by her freezing mind. But she couldn't afford to think that way. She couldn't afford to give up. At last, after what felt like an eternity, Rosa stumbled into a clearing. Through the whipping snow, she could see the outline of a small cabin nestled among the trees. It was old and worn, the wood dark with age, but to Rosa, it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. A faint glow of light shone through a window, the golden warmth of a fire flickering within. With the last of her strength, she made her way to the door, her frozen hands trembling as she reached for the handle. She knocked, her fists weakly tapping against the wood. For a moment, there was no sound but the howling wind. Rosa's heart sank. What if no one was there? What if she had come all this way only to find an empty cabin? But then she heard it, the faint creak of floorboards inside, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. The door opened just a crack, and a man's face appeared in the gap. His eyes were sharp and wary, scanning her up and down. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a thick beard streaked with gray. Rosa tried to speak, but the words froze in her throat. The man's gaze softened as he took in her appearance, her pale face, her trembling hands, the way she was barely standing. Without a word, he opened the door wider and pulled her inside. "Get in here before you freeze to death," he muttered, his voice gruff but not unkind. Rosa stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, collapsing onto the floor as the heat of the fire hit her. Her body ached, and her skin tingled painfully as the warmth began to seep in. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was just so tired. The man knelt beside her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled her coat off and wrapped a thick blanket around her. "You're lucky I found you," he said, his voice low. "A few more minutes out there, and you'd be a goner." Rosa wanted to thank him, to explain what had happened, but she was too weak to form the words. Instead, she nodded, her eyes fluttering closed as the exhaustion overtook her. She could hear the man moving around the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the clinking of metal as he prepared something, but it all faded into the background as sleep finally claimed her. When Rosa awoke, it was still dark outside. The storm had calmed, but the wind still rattled the windows of the cabin. She was lying on a small bed near the fire, wrapped in layers of blankets that cocooned her in warmth. The room smelled of wood smoke and something else, something savory. Sitting by the fire, the man was stirring a pot of stew. He glanced over at her as she stirred, his sharp eyes assessing her condition. "You're awake," he said, more of a statement than a question. "Good. You need to eat." Rosa struggled to sit up, her body still sore from the cold, but the warmth had revived her enough to move. The man handed her a bowl of stew, and she took it gratefully, the smell alone enough to make her realize how hungry she was. She sipped the broth, letting the heat warm her from the inside out. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." The man shrugged. "I wasn't going anywhere. This is my place." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Not many people come out this way. What were you doing in the middle of a storm like that?" Rosa hesitated, unsure of how to explain. How could she tell him that her own grandchildren had abandoned her, that she'd been left to freeze by the people she had cared for, loved and sacrificed so much for? The shame of it weighed heavily on her, but there was no point in hiding the truth. "I was left," she said quietly, her hands tightening around the bowl, "by my grandchildren. They drove off and left me in the cold." The man didn't say anything at first, just stared into the fire, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. "People can be cruel, especially family." His voice was low, as if he were speaking from experience. Rosa looked at him, surprised by the bitterness in his tone. "You've been through something like this." He gave a bitter laugh. "More than once. Family's supposed to stick together, but sometimes they're the ones who cut you deepest." He stood up and poked the fire, his face hardening as he stared into the flames. "I used to live in town, but after everything that happened, I decided I was better off out here, alone." The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of their shared pain filling the room. Rosa felt a pang of empathy for the man, a stranger who had saved her life, yet carried his own scars. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her heart aching for both of them. He shook his head. "Don't be. We all make our choices. Some of us just have to live with the consequences." Rosa knew that her own survival depended on more than just making it through the night. She couldn't go back to her old life. Not after what had happened. Her grandchildren's betrayal had cut too deep. But what could she do now? She had no family left to turn to, no one to rely on but herself. The man, whose name she learned was Bill, offered her a place to stay for as long as she needed. His cabin was small and isolated, but it was safe, warm, and most importantly, it was far from the people who had hurt her. Rosa accepted his offer, knowing that for now, this was the best chance she had. Over the next few days, as the storm outside continued to rage, Bill taught Rosa the basics of survival in the wilderness. He showed her how to chop wood, how to make a fire, and how to forage for food in the forest. It was hard work, but Rosa found herself growing stronger with each passing day. She had always been resilient. She had survived the loss of her children, had raised her grandchildren alone, and now she was learning to survive again. But the question remained, what would she do when the storm finally passed? Could she really leave everything behind and start a new life? Or would she find a way to confront the past and reclaim what was rightfully hers? For now, all she knew was that she wasn't the same woman who had been abandoned in the cold. She was stronger. She was a survivor. And whatever came next, she was ready for it. Rosa had always been strong. Even when life dealt her cruel hands, losing her children, raising her grandchildren alone, she found ways to endure. But now, the coldness of betrayal stung worse than the winter night that nearly claimed her life. As she sat in Bill's cabin, staring into the crackling fire, she felt the weight of her new reality. Her grandchildren, Ethan and Sarah, had left her to freeze, but worse than that, they had left her heartbroken. They were the last family she had, the people she had given everything for, and now they were gone. She sipped the warm broth Bill had made, its heat soothing her, but it couldn't chase away the numbness settling inside her. She didn't know where to go from here. Returning home meant facing the house that now felt haunted by their abandonment. Yet, staying here, in this quiet cabin nestled in the woods, wasn't a long-term solution. She couldn't hide from the world forever. Bill, who had been chopping wood outside, came in and sat across from her. He didn't ask many questions. He wasn't the type to pry. But the shared silences between them felt like an unspoken understanding. Bill had his own story. That much was clear. There was a certain hardness in his eyes, a man who had learned to live without the comfort of others. "You've got to decide what you're going to do," Bill said one evening, breaking the silence. He wasn't one for small talk, but his words always carried a weight. "Can't stay here forever." Rosa looked into the fire, her thoughts swirling like the snowstorm outside. He was right. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, but the thought of returning to her old life felt like stepping back into a place that had no room for her anymore. What could she even return to? A house full of memories, yes, but now those memories felt tainted. Everything she had built had crumbled in one night. "I don't know if I can go back," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "How can I face them after what they did?" Bill stared at the flames, his jaw tight. "People are cruel. Families no different. But you don't owe them anything, Rosa. What you do from here," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "that's up to you. But you've got to make that choice." The simplicity of his statement struck Rosa hard. Could it really be that simple? Could she choose to walk away from the life she had known, the family she had spent decades building and protecting? It felt wrong. It felt like giving up. Yet, at the same time, staying tied to people who had abandoned her, who saw her more as a burden than a person, felt equally unbearable. But one thing was clear. She couldn't continue living in limbo. Days turned into weeks as the storm outside began to calm, but inside, Rosa was still waging her own personal battle. Every morning, Bill would drag her out into the cold woods, teaching her the basics of survival. At first, Rosa resisted. She wasn't young anymore, and the physical exertion of chopping wood, gathering kindling, and carrying heavy loads of firewood left her muscles aching and her spirit drained. Yet there was something freeing about it too. In each task, she felt herself becoming stronger, not just physically, but mentally. Bill was a patient teacher, though not overly kind. He expected her to keep up, to work hard, and not complain. He taught her how to find edible plants in the forest, how to set traps for small animals, and how to read the signs of an approaching storm. At night, they would sit by the fire, and Bill would tell stories about his own life, how he had lost his family in a bitter feud over money and land, how he had left town to live off-grid, away from people who had only caused him pain. "It's not much of a life," he admitted one evening, the firelight casting shadows on his worn face. "But it's mine. I built it. And out here, no one can take that from me." Rosa envied that clarity, that sense of control over one's destiny. She had never felt like she had control, not since the day her daughter died in the accident. Her life had become a series of sacrifices, all for her grandchildren. She had done everything for them, and in the end, they had thrown it all away. What did that leave her with? But with each passing day, as she learned to split logs and light fires from scratch, Rosa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Self-reliance. She wasn't just the caretaker anymore. She wasn't defined by her family's needs. Out here, in this isolated cabin, she was learning to survive on her own terms. It was an empowering realization, one that began to reshape her view of the future. Moral dilemma. Should she confront them or move on? One cold morning, while they were out gathering wood, Bill spoke up again. "What's your plan, Rosa? You going back to that house?" Rosa paused, the axe in her hand feeling heavier than usual. She hadn't spoken much about her house or her grandchildren since the night they abandoned her. It was too painful, too raw. But Bill was right. She needed a plan. "I don't know," she admitted, wiping the sweat from her brow despite the cold. "I keep thinking about what it would mean to go back. I can't just act like nothing happened." Bill nodded. "No, you can't. But running from it won't fix anything either." Rosa sighed, leaning against the pile of wood they had chopped. "What would you do? Would you confront them?" Bill was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Depends on what you want," he said finally. "You want revenge? You want closure? Or do you just want to move on?" Rosa had never been one for revenge, but the thought of her grandchildren walking away without consequence, without understanding the gravity of what they had done, gnawed at her. Yet, another part of her longed for peace, for freedom from the toxic relationships that had led her to that cold night. Maybe moving on wasn't weakness, it could be strength. But moving on without confronting them felt like letting them win, like giving them power over her life. The choice weighed heavily on her, but deep down, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't move on until she faced them, until they understood what they had done. Just as Rosa was beginning to settle into her new routine, an unexpected event threw everything into chaos. One evening, as she and Bill were finishing their supper, there was a loud knock on the cabin door. Rosa froze, her heart pounding in her chest. No one came out here, not unless they were lost or in trouble. Bill, always cautious, grabbed his shotgun from beside the door before cracking it open. To both their shock, standing in the snowstorm was Sarah, Rosa's granddaughter. Rosa gasped, rising from her chair. Sarah looked different, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She was wrapped in a thick coat, but she looked as though she had been wandering for hours in the cold. "Grandma," Sarah choked out, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go." Bill stepped aside, his gaze hardening as he looked at Sarah. Rosa's heart raced with a mixture of emotions. Anger, fear, and something deeper, the undeniable pull of family. Despite everything, Sarah was still her granddaughter. But why had she come here now? What could she possibly want after everything she had done? Rosa let Sarah inside, but the tension was palpable. Sarah sat down by the fire, her hands trembling as she warmed them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Bill watched from the corner, his eyes sharp but silent. Finally, Rosa broke the silence. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rosa saw the little girl she had raised, not the cold stranger who had left her to freeze. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. We didn't know it would get that bad. Ethan, he said we'd come back, but then everything got so messed up. And I just didn't know what to do." Rosa's heart hardened at the mention of Ethan. "You left me, Sarah. You and Ethan. You left me in the cold, and I could have died." "I know," Sarah sobbed. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But I'm here now, because I need your help." Rosa's stomach twisted. She had known this moment would come, the moment when they would come crawling back, not out of love or regret, but out of need. But this time, Rosa wasn't the same woman they had left behind. "What do you need, Sarah?" Rosa asked, her voice steady. Sarah wiped her tears, her hands shaking. "Ethan, he's in trouble. He owes money to some bad people. They're threatening to hurt him if we don't pay them back." Rosa closed her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had expected this, expected that Ethan's anger and recklessness would lead him down a dangerous path. But now she was faced with a choice. Rosa sat frozen, her mind racing as Sarah's words echoed in the quiet of the cabin. Ethan was in trouble. Of course, it had come to this. In some dark part of her heart, Rosa had always known Ethan's recklessness would lead to disaster. But the part of her that had raised these children, the part of her that had held them when they cried and comforted them through their pain, still couldn't believe how far they had fallen. Sarah was sitting across from her, huddled near the fire, her face a mask of anxiety and regret. The same girl who had barely looked up from her phone weeks ago was now pleading with her, a broken reflection of the child Rosa had loved. "Grandma," Sarah's voice trembled, "I know we don't deserve your help. After everything. After what we did. But if you don't help us, I don't know what's going to happen to Ethan." Rosa's heart ached. She wanted to believe Sarah, to believe there was still some good in her grandchildren. But the pain of being left out in the cold was still fresh, like an open wound that refused to heal. Could she really forgive them? Could she let go of the betrayal so easily? "I need to understand something, Sarah," Rosa said, her voice calm but firm. "Why did you leave me that night? What was going through your head when you both drove off and left me there?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, and she wiped them away with the sleeve of her coat. "I don't know. It all happened so fast. Ethan was so angry. We were both stressed out about money. And then, he just snapped. I should have stopped him. I wanted to, but I didn't know how. I didn't think." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, shame radiating from her hunched shoulders. "You didn't think I might die out there." Rosa's voice was steady, but laced with the hurt she had been suppressing. "You didn't think I might freeze to death while you two went off to sort out your problems." Sarah flinched, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of the crackling fire between them. Finally, she shook her head. "No, I didn't think. And I hate myself for it. I've been thinking about it every day since. I'm so sorry." Bill, who had been sitting silently by the door, shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking between Rosa and Sarah. He said nothing, but his presence was a reminder that Rosa didn't have to face this alone. For weeks, he had been her support, her silent strength. And now, even with Sarah sitting there, begging for forgiveness, it was Bill's steady gaze that reminded Rosa she had the power to choose what came next. Rosa turned away from Sarah's tearful eyes and stared into the fire, her mind replaying the events of the past few weeks. The people in town had begun to talk, of course. Small towns were like that. Word spread fast, and even if Rosa hadn't been there to witness it, she knew what the conversations must have been like. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their voices hushed but judgmental. Some of them had likely sided with Ethan and Sarah, thinking Rosa was too old-fashioned, too unwilling to help her grandchildren in their time of need. They probably believed the lie Ethan had told about her refusing to support them financially. Others, though, would have seen the truth. They would have known that Ethan's anger was rooted in his own failures, not Rosa's unwillingness to help. Bill had mentioned it once, in passing, when he had gone to town for supplies. "People are talking, Rosa. Some think you should have given them what they wanted, but most of them are on your side." Rosa hadn't cared at the time. She had been too focused on survival, too consumed with her own feelings of betrayal. But now, sitting here with Sarah in front of her, she wondered how many people would expect her to forgive her grandchildren. How many of them believed in the power of family over all else, even after such a deep wound had been inflicted. The divide in the community was a reflection of the larger moral dilemma Rosa now faced. Should family bonds be strong enough to withstand betrayal? Or was there a point where even blood ties couldn't excuse the actions of those who had wronged you? The town might have its opinions, but ultimately, this was Rosa's decision to make. Sarah's words lingered in the air, filling the room with a tension that was almost suffocating. Ethan was in trouble with dangerous people, and now Sarah had come to ask for Rosa's help, as if the last few weeks had never happened. "What exactly does Ethan owe these people?" Rosa asked, her voice sharp and direct. Sarah swallowed hard, her face paling. "It's a lot of money, more than we can ever pay back. He got involved with some guys who loaned him money, but when he couldn't pay it back, things got bad." Rosa felt a wave of anger rise inside her. This was the pattern, wasn't it? Ethan always making reckless choices, always dragging others down with him. And now, once again, it was up to her to clean up his mess. "Do you know who these people are?" Rosa pressed, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Sarah shook her head. "No, but they're not the kind of people you can just walk away from. They threatened him, Grandma. They said if we don't get the money, they're going to hurt him." Rosa's mind raced, trying to process the gravity of the situation. Loan sharks, dangerous men. The kind of trouble that didn't just go away. And Ethan had dragged Sarah into it too. The thought of her grandchildren, even after everything they had done, being harmed by violent criminals sent a chill down her spine. But Rosa wasn't the same woman they had left behind. She had changed, grown stronger. She wasn't going to be manipulated by fear. If she was going to help, it would be on her terms, not because they demanded it. Rosa stood, her body aching from the effort, but there was a new strength in her stance. She looked at Sarah, her eyes hard but not without compassion. "If I help, it's going to be different this time," Rosa said, her voice firm. "I'm not just going to hand over money. I'm done fixing Ethan's mistakes without him learning anything. You and Ethan need to understand something. Actions have consequences. I'll help, but only if Ethan agrees to take responsibility." Sarah looked confused, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I'm not paying off his debts," Rosa continued. "Not outright. But I'll go with you to meet these people, and we'll figure out a way for Ethan to pay them back. I'll use what I've learned out here. I've spent my whole life bailing him out of trouble, and it's time for that to stop. If he's going to survive this, he needs to face it like a man, not run away." Sarah's face lit up with a flicker of hope, but Rosa wasn't done. "And when this is over, both of you will need to prove that you've changed. I won't be dragged into any more of Ethan's schemes, and I won't let you come crawling back only when you're in trouble. If you want my help, you need to earn back my trust." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We will, Grandma. I swear. We'll make it right." Bill, who had been silent throughout the conversation, stood up and moved closer to Rosa. "You're taking a big risk, Rosa," he said quietly. "These people don't mess around." "I know," Rosa replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not afraid. Not anymore." A high-stakes showdown. The next day, Rosa and Sarah set out for town, Bill joining them as an escort. Rosa wasn't going to face this alone, and Bill's presence brought a sense of security. He had lived through his own hardships and understood the world of violence and debts better than Rosa ever could. As they drove into the heart of town, Rosa felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, but there was no turning back now. They were going to meet Ethan and the men who threatened him, and she would find a way to make this right, not by giving in, but by standing tall and facing them head-on. The meeting place was a grimy garage on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where trouble lurked in every shadow. Ethan was already there, pacing nervously by the entrance. When he saw Rosa, his face went pale, guilt and fear battling for control. "Grandma, you didn't have to come," Ethan said, his voice shaking. Rosa looked at him, her eyes hard. "Yes, I did. But this time, it's different. You're going to face this, and you're going to fix it." As they stepped inside the garage, the loan sharks emerged from the darkness, their eyes cold and calculating. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Rosa stood her ground. She wasn't the same woman they had left behind in the cold. She was stronger now. The garage was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows over the grimy concrete floor. Rosa stood tall, despite the anxiety gnawing at her insides, as she faced the group of men who had dragged her grandson into their dangerous world. These weren't just loan sharks. They were predators, men who lived off the desperation of others. Her cold eyes sized up Rosa, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Ethan, standing beside her, looked smaller than she had ever seen him. His usual cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a haunted expression of regret and fear. He shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting as if unsure where to place them. Rosa could feel his panic, but she refused to let it infect her. She was here for one reason: to set things right, but not by giving in. She wasn't going to throw money at the problem, as Ethan had hoped. No, this time it would be different. The leader of the group, a man with a weathered face and a snake tattoo winding up his neck, leaned against the hood of a car. His gaze flicked from Ethan to Rosa, and a slow, menacing grin spread across his face. "So," he said, his voice thick with a lazy drawl, "this is the famous grandma. Heard a lot about you." He pushed himself off the car and swaggered toward them. His henchman, standing a few paces behind, watched with predatory amusement. Rosa stood firm, her eyes cold and steady. "I'm here to settle this," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of resolve. "But not the way you're thinking." Snake Tattoo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, I'm listening. What do you think you're gonna do, huh? Pay off your boy's debt? That's what you came for, right?" Rosa shook her head. "No, I'm not here to pay for Ethan's mistakes. I'm here to make sure he faces them." Ethan shot her a look, a mix of confusion and panic flashing in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected this. He had thought Rosa would sweep in, fix everything with money, and rescue him like she always did. But Rosa wasn't here to rescue anyone, not this time. Snake Tattoo's grin faded, replaced by a more calculating look. "And what exactly does that mean, old lady?" "He owes us. Big. We don't deal in second chances." Rosa took a step forward, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "You're right. He does owe you. And you're going to get paid, but not with money. I'm offering you something better." The tension in the room thickened as the men exchanged glances. Snake Tattoo crossed his arms, his expression skeptical but curious. "I'm listening." Rosa took a deep breath, knowing she was stepping into dangerous territory. "Ethan's been running from responsibility his whole life. I've enabled him, bailed him out time and time again. But that ends today. He's going to work for you, not as a thug, but as a man who owes a debt. He'll work until every cent is repaid, legitimately." Ethan's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Rosa silenced him with a sharp glance. He wasn't in control anymore. Rosa was. She continued, her voice hard as steel. "I know you run businesses. You own properties. There are ways to work off what he owes without turning him into another one of your lackeys. He'll do honest work, hard work, and he'll pay you back, not in cash, but in labor. Snake Tattoo tilted his head, intrigued by the offer. And what makes you think I'd go for that? He's just a punk. We don't have time for honest work. Rosa's gaze didn't waver. Because you know I'm right. You've dealt with a lot of people like Ethan, people who are more trouble than they're worth. But you're a businessman, and businessmen know a good deal when they see one. This way, you get what you're owed, and you don't have to worry about chasing him down every time he screws up again. He'll be your problem, but on my terms. There was a long, tense silence as Snake Tattoo studied Rosa, his eyes narrowing as he considered her proposition. The other men murmured quietly, clearly unsure of what to make of this unexpected turn. Finally, Snake Tattoo chuckled, a low, dangerous sound that sent a shiver down Rosa's spine. You've got guts, I'll give you that. He turned to Ethan, who looked as though he were about to faint. What do you think, kid? You up for paying off your debt the hard way? Ethan looked like a deer caught in headlights. His entire life, he had run from responsibility, always relying on others to fix his mistakes. And now, here he was, faced with a choice that terrified him more than anything, owning up to what he had done. Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can. You will, Rosa said sharply, her voice brokering no argument. You will, because you owe it to yourself as much as you owe it to them. It's time you stopped running. Snake Tattoo grinned, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Looks like Grandma's laying down the law, huh? Well, I'll tell you what, I'm willing to play along. Let's see if the kid's got the guts to back up your promises. But make no mistake, if he screws this up, his voice dropped to a low, threatening growl. There won't be another chance. Rosa nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face remained calm. He won't screw it up. I'll make sure of that. As they left the garage, Ethan remained silent. His shoulders slumped under the weight of what had just transpired. He had expected Rosa to save him, again. But instead, she had thrown him into the fire, forcing him to face his demons head-on. When they reached the car, Ethan finally broke the silence. Grandma, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Rosa turned to him, her face softening. Ethan, you've always been strong. You just never believed it. You've been running from your problems for so long, you've forgotten that you have the power to fix them. This is your chance to prove that you're more than the mistakes you've made. Ethan looked down at his hands, his face etched with guilt and fear. What if I fail? What if I mess everything up again? Rosa placed a hand on his shoulder. Then you'll get back up. You'll keep going. That's what life is, Ethan. It's not about never failing. It's about picking yourself up every time you do. And this time, you're not alone. You have me. And you have Sarah. Ethan glanced at his sister, who had been quiet through the whole ordeal, her own guilt weighing heavily on her. Sarah gave him a small, supportive nod, and for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope in Ethan's eyes. I'll try, he said softly. I'll really try. Over the next few months, Ethan worked harder than he ever had in his life. The deal with Snake Tattoo wasn't easy. Ethan was tasked with manual labor, working long hours in grueling conditions to pay off his debt. There were days when he came home exhausted, his body aching and his mind filled with doubts. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Rosa's words, "You're stronger than you think." Rosa stood by him, offering quiet support without coddling him. She refused to let him fall back into his old patterns, pushing him to keep going even when it seemed impossible. There were setbacks, of course, moments when Ethan stumbled, when the weight of his past mistakes seemed too much to bear. But Rosa never gave up on him. And slowly, something changed in Ethan. He began to take pride in his work, to realize that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The shame that had once haunted him began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to prove to himself and to Rosa that he could be better. Sarah, too, found her own path to redemption. She had been complicit in abandoning Rosa, but now she worked tirelessly to make amends. She visited Rosa often, helping her with chores around the house, cooking meals, and trying to rebuild the bond that had been shattered. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored. But Sarah was patient, and Rosa, though still wary, began to open her heart again. The town, once divided in its opinions, began to shift as well. Word spread about how Ethan was working off his debt, about how Rosa had stood firm in the face of danger and made her grandchildren face their responsibilities. People who had once judged her for not giving in to Ethan's demands now admired her strength. The divide between those who believed in family loyalty and those who valued self-reliance began to blur as Rosa's story became one of both. Months later, as the sun set over the town and the first hints of spring began to appear, months passed, and Rosa found herself standing on her front porch, looking out at the same road where Ethan and Sarah had once left her in the cold. The weather had changed, the snow giving way to the tender buds of spring. But the real transformation had taken place inside Rosa. She was not the same woman who had watched helplessly as her grandchildren drove away that fateful night. The old Rosa had been a woman of quiet endurance, one who bore the burdens of others without complaint, believing it was her role to give without expecting anything in return. But now she stood taller, wiser, her heart fortified by the trials she had endured, and the choices she had made the past few months had been a crucible, one in which both she and her grandchildren had been tested and transformed. Ethan had faced his debts, both to the loan sharks and to himself. Every day had been a struggle for him, working long hours under the watchful eye of Snake Tattoo and his crew, but the hard labor had reshaped more than just his body. It had reshaped his character. He had learned the value of honest work, of responsibility, and of owning up to his mistakes. He had stopped hiding behind excuses and had begun to truly make amends, not just to his creditors, but to Rosa, and more importantly, to himself. Sarah, too, had grown. Once lost in the haze of social media and disconnection, she had come back to reality. She spent more time at Rosa's side, helping her with chores, cooking dinners like they used to, and reestablishing the bond they had both neglected. Their conversations now were not just about trivial matters, but about the deep, emotional truths they had once avoided. Sarah apologized often, too often, in Rosa's opinion. But Rosa knew it wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about showing, through action, that they had all changed. Rosa still remembered the disbelief and pain from the night they left her behind, but the wounds had begun to heal. Forgiveness had been a slow process, one that didn't come with a single conversation or a single act of remorse. Trust, like the thawing snow outside, needed time to melt and give way to new growth. In a town as small as theirs, everyone knew what had happened. At first, the community had buzzed with rumors and gossip. Some had criticized Rosa for not giving in to Ethan's demands, calling her stubborn and old-fashioned. Others had praised her for standing her ground, for refusing to be manipulated by those who should have respected her. But after Ethan started working off his debt, after word spread of Rosa's confrontation with the loan sharks, the tone of the conversations changed. People began to respect her, not just as a sweet old lady who had raised her grandchildren, but as a woman of strength, someone who had taken control of her own fate and had refused to be a victim. Rosa became something of a local legend, the grandmother who had faced down a gang and emerged victorious, not with violence, but with her principles intact. Her decision to make Ethan face his responsibilities had resonated with the town in ways she hadn't expected. People began to talk about responsibility, about the importance of standing up for yourself, even against family. Some of the older townsfolk, who had been skeptical of Rosa's approach at first, began to see her point of view. Family was important, yes, but so was accountability. It wasn't just the older generation who learned from Rosa's example. Young people, many of whom had heard of Ethan's story through whispers and rumors, began to see that running from problems wasn't the solution. Rosa had shown that there was strength in facing life's challenges head-on, and that doing so didn't mean you had to go it alone. It meant building a support system and finding the strength within yourself to take the first step. One day, Ethan came to visit Rosa, as he often did now that his debt was nearly paid off. He no longer looked like the angry, lost young man who had once stormed out of her house in a fit of rage. There was a calmness in his eyes now, a quiet determination that Rosa had never seen before. He sat down at the kitchen table, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Rosa poured him a cup of tea, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the birds singing outside the window. "Grandma," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. I've been working hard, paying off what I owe, but I don't want to go back to the way things were. I've changed. I want to do something better with my life." Rosa looked at him, pride swelling in her chest. "You have changed, Ethan. I can see it. What do you want to do?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then spoke with conviction. "I want to start over. Maybe go back to school or get some real training. I don't want to live in debt or make the same mistakes again. I want to make you proud." "You already have," Rosa said softly. "The fact that you're thinking about your future, that you're taking responsibility, that's all I ever wanted for you. You don't need to prove anything to me, Ethan. Just keep moving forward." Sarah, too, had found her own path. She had started volunteering at the local community center, helping kids with after-school programs. Spending time with those kids had reminded her of how much love and care Rosa had poured into raising her and Ethan. It made her realize how selfish she had been in recent years and how much she had taken Rosa for granted. Volunteering became more than just a way to give back. It became a way for Sarah to heal, to rebuild her sense of purpose. The three of them, Rosa, Ethan, and Sarah, were still a family, but a different kind of family now. A stronger one. One built not on old habits and unspoken resentments, but on honesty, respect, and the hard-earned knowledge that they had survived something together. They had come out on the other side, scared but stronger. One afternoon, as Rosa sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she made a decision. The house, her house, the one she had poured her heart and soul into, had become a symbol of everything she had endured. It had seen joy, love, pain, and betrayal. But now it felt like it was time to let go. Rosa had always resisted the idea of leaving, of selling the house and moving on. It had been her home for so many years, the place where she had raised her children, and later her grandchildren. But as the months had passed, she had begun to realize that holding onto the house was also holding onto the past, and the past was something she no longer wanted to live in. She called Ethan and Sarah together one evening. They sat around the table, just as they had done so many times before, but this time there was a sense of peace between them. "I've been thinking," Rosa began, her voice steady, "that it's time for me to move on from this house." Ethan and Sarah looked at her, surprised. "Grandma, are you sure?" Sarah asked, concern in her voice. "This is your home." "It was," Rosa said with a soft smile. "But now it's time for a new chapter. I've spent so much of my life here, and I've loved this house. But I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to move somewhere smaller, somewhere simpler, maybe closer to town, where I can walk to the market and see people more often." Ethan and Sarah exchanged a look, both understanding that this was not an easy decision for Rosa, but also realizing that it was one she had thought long and hard about. "We'll help you," Ethan said, "whatever you need." And so, with their help, Rosa put the house on the market. It didn't take long for a young family to fall in love with the place, just as Rosa had all those years ago. As she packed up her belongings, she didn't feel sadness. Instead, she felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that came from letting go of the weight she had been carrying for so long. On the day of the move, Rosa stood in the empty living room, the walls bare and the echoes of memories fading into the past. Ethan and Sarah were outside, loading the last of the boxes into the car. Rosa took one last look around, her heart full but not heavy. She had made her peace with the past, and now she was ready for the future. As she stepped outside into the warm spring air, she felt the sun on her face and smiled. She had faced the coldest night of her life and had come through stronger. Now, it was time to live the rest of her life on her own terms. One afternoon, as Rosa sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she made a decision. The house, her house, the one she had poured her heart and soul into, had become a symbol of everything she had endured. It had seen joy, love, pain, and betrayal. But now it felt like it was time to let go. Rosa had always resisted the idea of leaving, of selling the house and moving on. It had been her home for so many years, the place where she had raised her children, and later her grandchildren. But as the months had passed, she had begun to realize that holding on to the house was also holding on to the past, and the past was something she no longer wanted to live in. She called Ethan and Sarah together one evening. They sat around the table, just as they had done so many times before, but this time there was a sense of peace between them. "I've been thinking," Rosa began, her voice steady, "that it's time for me to move on from this house." Ethan and Sarah looked at her, surprised. "Grandma, are you sure?" Sarah asked, concern in her voice. "This is your home." "It was," Rosa said with a soft smile. "But now it's time for a new chapter. I've spent so much of my life here, and I've loved this house, but I don't want to live in the past anymore. I want to move somewhere smaller, somewhere simpler, maybe closer to town, where I can walk to the market and see people more often." Ethan and Sarah exchanged a look, both understanding that this was not an easy decision for Rosa, but also realizing that it was one she had fought long and hard about. "We'll help you," Ethan said, "whatever you need." And so, with their help, Rosa put the house on the market. It didn't take long for a young family to fall in love with the place, just as Rosa had all those years ago. As she packed up her belongings, she didn't feel sadness. Instead, she felt a sense of freedom, a lightness that came from letting go of the weight she had been carrying for so long. On the day of the move, Rosa stood in the empty living room, the walls bare and the echoes of memories fading into the past. Ethan and Sarah were outside, loading the last of the boxes into the car. Rosa took one last look around, her heart full but not heavy. She had made her peace with the past, and now she was ready for the future. As she stepped outside into the warm spring air, she felt the sun on her face and smiled. She had faced the coldest night of her life and had come through stronger. Now it was time to live the rest of her life on her own terms. As Rosa drove away from the house with Ethan and Sarah, she looked at them and asked, "Do you think people can really change, or do we just learn to hide who we really are?" The question lingered in the air, as it would linger in the minds of the viewers watching the story unfold. Could Ethan and Sarah's transformation last? Could Rosa truly leave behind the pain of the past? The story ended not with answers, but with the understanding that some questions, like life itself, were complex and ever-evolving.